So today on Online for Authors, I'm chatting with Michael Pietrobon, founder of Foglio, a self-publishing consulting firm, and he's here to chat with us about good book design and why it matters. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Teri.
And hopefully I didn't mess up that last name too much.
No, you're all good.
Good. So before we really get into book design, why don't you tell everybody about yourself and why I have you on to talk with us about this topic?
So I've been designing books or involved in books in some capacity over the last decade, since my early days of university. So I started out doing more academic publications, and I am formally trained as an editor, although these days my focus is more on book design.
All right.
And I've been doing this for about 10 years. And in the last few years, this year in particular, starting Foglio, my self-publishing company, my focus has been mostly on design, and particularly design of novels, memoirs, short fiction, poetry, that sort of thing. Not really too involved with the academic stuff anymore, but still able to do that stuff. So
right. So when you say book design, what is it that you're talking about? Are you talking about cover? Are you talking about interior? What is book design?
Well, I'll get a little ethereal, or if that's the word, with this. It's everything that the senses interact with in a book. So, and that applies to an ebook, a print book, any type of publication in any type of medium I work with. So it involves, of course, cover design, interior typesetting, and ebook design. These are the three major categories, right?
Okay.
All of them, the way I work at least, all of them are informed by the cover design. So we start with the cover design, and from that we develop a design language that applies to the rest of the book. And it carries off into the typesetting as well. All kinds of custom elements that interact with the reader in an enjoyable way. So we're not just doing cookie cutter typesetting. It's very easy to do that, but we try to augment it a little bit and make it true to the author's intentions, whatever they may be. And then, of course, then that design is carried off into ebook design, and we can do incredible things with an ebook through HTML and CSS, as you may know, to really bring that design to life in an interactive format through all kinds of multimedia and different cool features we can do with EPUBs.
So I think a lot of people do have the assumption that, you write the book and then you give it to someone like you who puts it into a formula, and bam, your book is now ready to be an ebook, or your book is now ready for print. And so you're saying that it doesn't have to be a one size fits all. So talk to me a little bit about that. You say like the cover helps you make decisions. Like, what are you talking about when you say, it helps you decide what you're doing next? Like, to me, I give mine to someone who just takes care of it for me, and I'm thankful for that. So I don't really know exactly all that you're doing or they're doing from the point that I hand it in.
So the job of a designer, or a good designer, is to make the process as easy as possible for the author or the client, right?
Right.
So it's probably a good thing that
I know nothing.
that you don't know so much about the process, right? That's the sign of a professional, right? Although I like to involve the authors I work with as much as possible. I offer unlimited revisions, of course. So what I mean when I say this, I have this as an example, and for those of you only listening, this is a very beautiful book. This is Here Comes the Sun by Alan Bryce. And, he wanted this artwork on the cover.
Right.
So this is basically his design, and he used me as a sort of tool to express what he wanted to do, right? Because I have the graphic design skills that he may be lacking. I put it together in the way that he wanted. That's the typeface on the cover. And then on the spine, we have this custom dinkus, right? So just like an ornamental little thing. And this little icon, if I can find one, carries throughout the book, right? So we have them throughout the book. And the book is called Here Comes the Sun. That's a little sun, right?
Sun, right.
I've done similar things for other books. So that's part of what I mean. I mean, like, essentially you're putting text on a page and you want it to be legible and nicely spaced. There are certain rules that you're always going to apply to any book, and
Right.
they may often seem very similar, but there are elements that are carried from the cover, as I just showed, throughout the interiors, and then of course that is carried into the ebook design later as well.
Right. Right. And so I know that like some of what we're talking about is like what font to use. I know there are certain fonts that are used more regularly than others, but there isn't just one. When you open up books, if you go to a store and you open up different books, you'll see that there are different fonts within. But there's also things like how much white space and how far like are the lines. I've picked up books before that I've enjoyed the book but hated reading it because I felt like the words were very cramped and crammed, and we were trying to see how many words we could fit into one page, and I never felt like I got a break while reading. It always felt very heavy and difficult. And so that, in your opinion, wouldn't be a good book design, right? Because it made me feel like I was wading through the words instead of reading them.
I can't tell you the number of times I've picked up a book that was on sale at Chapters or Barnes and Noble, and the $3-4 book. I'm like, oh, this is great. Bring it home, try to read it, and I just cannot get through it. Like, I have to buy a better edition that has the text laid out in a nicer format. So what we try to do is to have the reader in mind. And the way I break it down is this: the cover design is what's going to attract readers initially. Right. The interior typesetting is what keeps readers reading, and that's almost more important, right?
Exactly. I mean, you need them to pick it up, but if they don't finish it, it doesn't really help that they picked it up. Right?
Exactly. Right. Because I mean, a reader who reads the whole book will likely leave a positive review or any kind of review, but that helps either way. And so my focus when I'm typesetting a book is consideration for the reader's needs, right? And me being a reader and an author myself, I am very much aware of this. So font choice is one thing, but yes, like you said, white space, good margins, and then space between the lines is also very important, right?
Right. I can't remember now what book it was. It was, everybody was reading it, and I picked it up at the library and I thought, oh my gosh, I am never going to be able to finish this book because it felt very close together. And I don't have the best eyes, and so I'm having to use readers now in order to read. And it was like, even with my readers, I felt like everything was too small and too cramped and too dark and it was just too much. And so to be able to have a little more breathing space is what the interior does, right? Something else that I've noticed on a lot of people who self-publish their books, which I think is, it's a wonderful thing to be able to be out there and doing that. But, maybe you get to the ebook and you'll see where the formatting wasn't done quite right. And so you'll be reading along and then all of a sudden there's this big gap. And then you get to start again because something happened. I'm sure it was in the coding somewhere. You left this space. And so that's another thing that interior design is working with.
That's right. And there are a few considerations there. So it could be that an author or someone hired by the author is just doing a quick conversion, and is no lack of $99, $59 conversion services that'll just put the document into this converter and spit out whatever. Right. What we do is a little more deliberate and hands-on, and we look for all these breaks. But to give these other designers and services the benefit of the doubt, there are certain cases, because an ebook is called a reflowable ebook and the settings are dependent on the user's preferences, that you change the settings in a certain way. And these days you can change the line spacing, you can change the margins, you can change the font, everything. It is possible that the user is using settings that maybe are forcing line breaks that would not otherwise happen. That is possible. We try to avoid it as much as possible, but it can happen, right? Because this whatever software you're using or device you're using to read the book kind of has a mind of its own, and it does what it wants, and not everything is immediately apparent to the person designing the book.
Exactly. I think that there's also the understanding that, like, if you go to put a book into the Amazon, the KDP, or you're going to go put your ebook into maybe Ingram, it's not necessarily the same system. So just because it works in one doesn't mean it's going to work in the other. So you have to be able to put it in different ways. Is that correct? Am I right with that?
It should be the same. I mean,
Yeah.
An ebook is, in a way, just a web page, right? Like a very simple HTML and CSS web page. So sure, as everyone knows, if you open a website on your phone or you open it on your tablet or on your computer, it's going to look slightly different. Things will be aligned differently. And what we do in our very involved design process is try to mitigate these errors by testing on multiple devices.
Right.
Multiple devices, multiple software on one computer, right? So Apple Books or the Kindle Previewer or whatever else, right?
Right. So that all matters. How important do you think it is? I know that there are some services out there who are doing a lot of, I don't know, pretty design in each chapter. So, you have chapter 1 and it has, like, I don't know, some kind of a design element across the top. And then when you get to chapter 2, that same design element, or design elements that run down the sides of certain pages and those kinds of things. How important is that to a reader to have those kinds of design elements when they're reading a book?
I think that's a matter of taste and maybe a matter of the genre that we're working with.
Okay.
Like a romance novel might give to that a little more easily, but like a lot of the books I work on, memoirs, novels, it doesn't seem appropriate.
Okay.
But I do like the idea in general of giving that extra custom touch to the interiors and not just having it text with, large titles and basic stuff like that.
Right.
I do like adding that little bit of personalization. So yeah, nothing against it.
Right.
Would be concerned that it's executed properly, right?
Exactly. So when you are making those kinds of decisions, do you sit with your author and say, hey, here's some options? Or do you say to your author, based on your genre, this is what I would recommend, and then give them the opportunity? Like if someone said to me that, like, do you want these frilly things across the top of your chapters? I don't know what the answer is. Mm-hmm. And so how do you go about helping an author kind of navigate all of the different possibilities and know what is okay and what isn't okay?
So before the initial consultation and during the initial consultation, I gather as much information as I can about the book. I read selected excerpts. It's impossible for me to read every single book that I design, but I ask for passages that they believe are relevant to my work and ask for inspiration, whether it's certain paintings, photos, whatever it may be. And I come up with something called spec sheets. That's an old print term. Spec sheets. So it's just a little sampling of the first maybe 5 to 10 pages, just to show all the different design elements that we may include. And I leave it entirely up to them. Like, they could scrap that spec sheet entirely and we begin fresh. Or if they proceed and they want minor revisions, we go ahead. Now, there is a certain point where authors are authors and designers are designers, and it's very rare that the two are found in the same person, right? So I tend to make these decisions myself, and then if there's no rejection of them, of course the author has the final say. But if there's no immediate rejection or no major questions about it, we proceed in that style. And by and large, authors take my advice as a designer, right? Not to say it's the right choice, but it's an informed choice, having done many books as I've done, right?
Right. Well, and I feel that way too, even about, like, when you have an editor, the editor shouldn't have the last word, but as an author, you should be trusting your editor enough that you're taking their word at least 9 times out of 10. If you're not taking their word 9 times out of 10, I would think it would be the same with design elements. Maybe you have an idea of something that you would like to try, but more than likely your designer has a better understanding of the process and what is kind of expected in the genre than you do.
Certainly.
in terms of like reading. And it's interesting because prior to becoming an author, I didn't pay a lot of attention to all of those things. Like, I think I did subliminally. I wasn't really aware. Like, I pick up certain books because they appeal to me. And when I open certain books, they feel, this will sound crazy, they'll feel friendly to me, and if a book doesn't feel friendly, I tend to close it up and put it back on the shelf. And so that friendly feel is what you're doing.
Yeah. If that's what it calls for. Sometimes it might call for a menacing feel, right? So
well, that's true. But I think by friendly, I mean reader friendly. I mean, it just feels, it feels, oh, I could sit and read this instead of that, I also, is this a design thing? Like, I know there's different paper that you can do. You can do the glossy paper, you can do the smooth edges, you can do the more rough edge. Is that something that you're helping the author decide as well?
So I think that is a great benefit of my personal experience, having worked in print in particular, design for print. So I've designed books and then actually seen them and held them in my hands and proofing and making revisions back and forth. I know how certain design elements will interact with paper. I'm very familiar with how Amazon KDP prints a book versus how we print a book, for example, and I will design accordingly, right? So yeah, like for example, if you have color images, I very rarely go with like a cream colored stock, but there are certain cases where an author may find that is appropriate if it feeds into the theme of the novel or the memoir, whatever it is, right? Maybe that kind of sepia tone that comes from images on a cream stock is appropriate, right? So it always depends on the project, but yes, it's a very much, at least for the typesetting and cover design, very much a print-centered design process. Right.
What about the different textures of paper? Some of the paper, especially on older books, but I've noticed that they're doing it now on some of the new books, is a rougher, and the edges aren't as smooth, like when you open, do you know what I'm talking about?
I do. Yeah. So that would be like a recycled stock.
Maybe that's what it is. Is that also something that is that part of the design, or is that more of wherever you have it printed?
That wouldn't necessarily be part of the design. I mean, in a sense, the entire scope of designing the book would involve that choice in paper. But it's rare that would really affect the graphic design.
The graphic part of it, right.
But yeah, it is a consideration. And as an aside, I love that paper. I prefer it's the cheapest paper you can get. And I love it more than anything else, more than these gloss and silk coated stocks. I love that stuff. It just feels nice in the hands. So
I was going to ask, is it a feel thing for you? It just feels good in your hand?
It's a feel, and also like reading a book that's printed on bright white paper is very jarring to me. And I think it is for many readers. It's just too much, the way it interacts with light. This kind of calms things down a little bit. It's like a dimmer switch on
it is.
On the page, right? It's lovely.
Yeah. Those books with those pages often remind me of older books, the ones that I remember getting in the library as a kid, that weren't all the high tech glossy stuff. And so there is kind of I don't know, it's just a warm feeling. I'm way older than you are. And so I have more memories of these older books. What are some of like the major rules for book design? And then is there ever a time for like breaking those rules?
Well, there's always room to break rules. And I try to do it as often as possible, but we don't do it without good reason, right? For example, well, I'll show you. This is my novel. Again, another absolutely gorgeous cover for those of you listening. How often do you see a chapter begin like that with the text off to one side and the title off to the other side, right?
Yes.
Like
very
things
rarely.
Divided vertically rather than horizontally.
Right.
So that was a deliberate choice that I made for my own novel. And I knew that it broke certain conventions of how you start off the chapter of a book.
Exactly. Right.
But I think the guiding principle should be in the result. So if you have a results-oriented design process and you're not just breaking rules just to break them, but you have something to say with
Right.
the breaking of them. And it's entirely within the realm of possibility that, you have a perfectly fine conventional book design that works, right? There's no reason that you have to break rules or push boundaries at all. But I like to do it whenever I can, and when an author's willing, right?
Right. Okay, so I think that's interesting. The just that idea. I like what you said, and I feel that way about a lot of rules about writing. When people say, "Well, you have to do this and you have to do that," and I tend not to like people to tell me what I can and can't do, but I like to have a reason for why I'm doing it differently.
Mhm.
I like to know at least my reason. Why am I choosing to ignore, the common wisdom? Why am I going against that? And so you feel the same then with design, is as long as there's a reason, at least why you're doing it, then
Yeah.
it makes sense, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. All right. So let's talk covers for a moment, because you say that's kind of where you start. What should authors be aware of when they are choosing a cover design, or when they're working with someone who is creating a cover design for them?
It's tough to say, because when I'm working in a certain genre, if I'm designing a book for horror or science fiction, there are certain conventions that readers expect within those genres.
Right.
And part of my work involves like some market research, see what other books in that genre look like. And I try to one up them, right? In the best way that I can.
Right.
And so it's difficult to say, because some authors want to remain true to what that genre entails, right? Especially when you're talking about memoirs, right? Most authors will just want the cover to have just a picture of themselves with the text, very simple, basic, and that's perfectly fine. There are certain situations where it's appropriate to shatter these conventions and norms, especially if the writing itself does that. So it's all based on a conversation with the author. And if you're asking what authors should be looking for when selecting a cover, I think first and foremost, as cheesy as it sounds, like, it needs to be true to the book that they're writing, right? That they've written. And whatever that means. And it is the case, as I mentioned earlier, that an author may not be able to express that visually, right? Or may not know how. That's where the work of an experienced designer comes in. And they can certainly help with bringing that vision to life. Like, as I mentioned in my process of reading excerpts of the book and seeing what that, because really a designer is the first reader of a book, right?
Yeah.
The first person of the public to read the book. So that's invaluable insight into how readers might interact with your work, and the way they design accordingly is very valuable, right?
I know that for me, getting the cover design has been a tricky, I don't know, like, I have a vague idea in my mind that I cannot tell you, because I can't even really bring it, but I have a vague idea, and I'll tell you what I know, and then I get a design and I look at it and I think, that doesn't do it for me at all. But usually from that point, I can now say, okay, this is what I like and this is what I don't like. And then and then from there, it takes shape. And so for me, the first round, I've never been happy with my first round. And I think it's probably because I don't do a really good job explaining what's in my head visually. And so it takes a little bit of back and forth before it's like, there we go. Now that feels like what I've got in my head. So how much back and forth do you have with your authors?
Typically, a cover will go up to version 10, 11, 12, around there, right? It sometimes more, sometimes less. Sometimes we get it not
right on.
right away, but like very close right from the start. But what you described is perfectly fine, right? It may be a little frustrating at first to, open the email, you're all excited and you're like, this falls flat, right? But it gives you a really good origin point to articulate what you need next, right?
Right.
To work from there. So that's always useful. And authors should keep in mind that the revision process is where things come to life. It's not really in the first draft.
Right. I think the first draft helps me to be able to say things like, I really like that font, or that font looks scary to me, and my book doesn't have I actually had one that it came back and it was like, that looks too much like a romance, and this book is not a romance. And in order to not make it look like a romance, what if we did, like, it helped me. At least now I have a starting place that I can say, I like this piece and I don't like this piece. But it is a little hard as someone who I'm a writer. I'm not a visual artist. And so, I was asked, actually, one of the things that was asked of me was to send some covers that I liked from other authors, other covers that I liked. Well, the problem is that they were all over the map. Like if I had sent them to you, you would have, bashed your hand into your forehead and said, there's nothing here that's similar, because some of them were super colorful and very modern, and other of them were very traditional and very monochromatic. And it's like, I don't know what captures my attention. So I don't know. I find that part to be a little frustrating as I'm going through it. And maybe what you said is what I needed to hear, which is the first draft is never going to be the one.
Yeah, that's certainly true. But also what you described of these different inspirational covers that you submitted that are so divergent, I think a good designer can find a common thread between those, no matter what, right? There is something, and there's a little bit of, amateur psychoanalysis going on, saying like, what is it exactly that Teri
is capturing her, right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think that as an author, when my first book, I wrote it and I thought, great, now I'm done. And then it was like, oh, you mean there's this whole process that I have to go through to get my book out? And that part was as difficult as getting the book written. The little blurb you're going to put on the back, and the what you're going to have on your cover, and how you want your chapter headers to look, and all these things. It was like, oh my gosh, there's more. Like, I thought I was done.
Yeah, you're certainly right there. That's only the beginning of the work, finishing the manuscript, right, or editing the manuscript. And again, a good designer should make this process as easy as possible for you. And I try to make it fun. I try to make it engaging. And it at a certain point, it's just work, right? There's
I mean,
especially when it comes to the interiors, page after page of black and white text, and it can become a little dry, especially when you're revising and checking for errors and missed this or that. But taking one step at a time, anything's manageable, right? It's all possible. So.
Yeah, I think that the thing for especially new authors who are just starting out this process is to recognize that you have to give it time. Like, you don't finish up your book, get it back from the editor, that's part's done, and then assume that now tomorrow you can put your book, onto Amazon. That isn't the way it's going to work. It takes a lot more time than that, because you're even if everybody got everything right on the first try, there's still a lot of things that are going on. There's a lot of moving parts to get that book out into the hands of a reader.
Well, I'd even wager to say that you wouldn't want it to get perfect the first go around, right? It wouldn't feel like a very rewarding experience.
No.
Instantly, that's the cover, that's the interiors, upload it, we're done.
Okay, we're done. Yeah. No, you do want to make sure that what you wrote has a beautiful way of going out to the public.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's yes, what we write is very, very important. That is the main thing. However, if it doesn't look good, then no one will ever read it. And so you have to make sure that you have it sitting in a pretty frame, right? It needs to be it isn't just a beautiful work. It has to be a beautiful work that is presented in such a way that someone says, ooh, and wants to pick it up.
Yep. And another consideration that authors have these days that they may not have had 15, 20 years ago is that a potential reader's first interaction with your book is going to be as a little thumbnail that big, right? Yeah. So design has changed because of that, right? There's no more of this minimalist kind of design that you had in the 60s and 70s with book design. You have just a little title at the top and then this big piece of abstract artwork. That doesn't really work anymore. It can. There are ways of making it work, but in general, you'd want that title to be visible at that thumbnail size, right? So, right. Yeah,
that I hadn't even considered that now, because of the way we often interact with books in a catalog-like thing on your phone, right? And so your phone is making it even smaller. It'd be one thing if you had your great big screen, but most people now are even doing it on their phone, which means that little thumbnail has to be, I don't know, capture your attention as much as if the book was sitting in front of you.
Yeah.
That I had not considered that consideration. That is a really good thought. Do you ever worry about how a cover looks maybe in black and white? If someone, like a lot of Kindles, when people get on a Kindle, if they have a black and white Kindle and they're looking through to pick which book they're going to do next, it will be in black and white. Do you ever think about how that cover translates back and forth between color and a black and white?
That's a very good question. And maybe I should more, but to be honest, no, it's not often a consideration.
Okay.
Because in most cases, any design that you have will translate to a legible format in black and white. It's not really that big of a concern, but it is something to keep in mind. And thank you for that.
Yeah, well, the reason I brought it up, I have a friend who was designing her own. Well, she had someone that was helping her design a cover, but she was going to self-publish, and she was doing most of this work herself. And she uploaded to her Kindle, which was in black and white. And because it was a light black background and it had a white title in black and white, that title faded into the black background so much that you couldn't see it.
Okay.
And so it looked fine in color, but in black and white, it faded away. And so she realized then that she needed to make sure that the title was somehow outlined in a way that when it went into black and white, that it stood out enough from the background. And I thought that was just an interesting, I would have never thought to even look. Because I don't usually do black and white. I mean, most people don't, but there are those devices that are black and white. So
that is a good thing to consider. And a wonderful thing about EPUBs is that you can have these conditional things in there through JavaScript and whatever, that if this is a black and white device, that use this cover file instead. So that, you can upload the same file everywhere.
Right.
I did this recently with an ebook, not exactly what you're describing, but there was this black and white artwork that I put on the first page, on the title page, right? And knowing that ebooks have this ability to use dark mode, so they have a black background.
Exactly.
If you were to translate that to dark mode, of course, the text will turn white or light gray, whatever, but the artwork would remain black, so therefore invisible. So I made a second version of the artwork that had the colors inverted, right? So everything that was black was white, everything that was white was black or transparent. And I put both of these images in, and with this little conditional phrase, ensure that whenever this toggle was switched between dark mode and light mode, that the image would switch. So it would always be visible. Right?
I love
there are
that.
ways of doing that with the cover.
Yeah. Oh, wow. I didn't even know that was a possibility. And see, this is why having someone who knows design, right, who knows what they're doing makes sense, because that allows those kinds of things to work well. And I would have never considered that. Well, Michael, this has been absolutely fabulous. We've learned a lot. If someone wanted to get in touch with you and work with you or ask you some questions, how do they go about doing that?
So my website is foglioprint.com. There's a silent G in there. So it's Foglio print.com.
And I'll have that in the show notes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And reach out to me anytime. I'm always taking on new work and happy to meet new authors. So,
all right. Well, thank you so much for being with us today.
Of course. Thank you, Teri. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Online for Authors, where I, Teri M Brown, author of character-driven fiction and host of the podcast, introduce readers to characters they'd love to invite to lunch. Tune in next Tuesday for another podcast episode.